I never thought that a $20 marketplace find would be the thing that ended my life, but as I sit here in the dark, listening to the wood of my front door groan under the weight of a man who wants what is inside this box, I realize how wrong I was. It started 3 days ago when I was scrolling through local listings, looking for a unique Christmas gift for myself because I knew no one else was going to buy me anything worth having this year. I found it on the 3rd page of results. A heavy, ornate jewelry box made of dark mahogany with tarnished silver inlay that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than a dusty garage in the suburbs. The seller was a man named Elias who insisted on meeting in a gas station parking lot at dusk. And looking back, I should have noticed how his hands were shaking when he handed it over for such a low price. He didn't even count the money I gave him. He just dropped the bills into his pocket and drove away before I could even ask him if he had the key for the heavy, iron lock that held the lid shut. When I got home, the box sat on my dining room table like a challenge, its dark wood catching the dim light of my apartment while I tried every spare key I owned to get it open. There was something unsettling about the weight of it, a shifting thud that suggested whatever was inside wasn't just jewelry or old trinkets, but something dense and wrapped in cloth. I spent the better part of my Friday evening with a screwdriver and a hammer, carefully prying at the hinge because I didn't want to ruin the beautiful finish. Yet the curiosity was gnawing at me like a physical hunger. Why was the lock so reinforced for a simple jewelry box? And why did Elias look like he was escaping a crime scene when he sold it to me? Finally, with a sickening crack of splintering wood, the internal mechanism gave way and the lid swung open to reveal the smell of old copper and stale, trapped air. Inside, there was no gold or silver, but rather a collection of Polaroid photographs wrapped in a stained kitchen towel and a heavy, rusted metal object that I realized with a jolt of adrenaline was a discarded firing pin from a handgun. My heart began to race as I spread the photos out under the light, my hands trembling as I saw the same man in every shot, captured from a distance while he was entering his home, checking his mail, or sleeping in a chair by his window. This wasn't a jewelry box at all. It was a stalker's trophy case, a chronological record of someone being hunted in their own home during the holiday season. The last photo was the most terrifying because it showed the interior of my own apartment building, taken from the street just 2 days ago, with a red circle drawn around my 3rd-floor window. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest, and I immediately reached for my phone to call the police, but the screen remained black despite my frantic tapping because the battery had died during my hours of prying at the box. It was then that the first sound came from the hallway, a soft, rhythmic scraping against the floorboards that sounded like someone dragging a heavy coat along the wall. I froze in place, my breath hitching in my throat as I stared at the door, wondering if I had remembered to engage the deadbolt after I brought the groceries in earlier that afternoon. The silence of the apartment became deafening, amplified by the ticking of the clock on the wall and the distant, muffled sound of a neighbor's Christmas carols playing through the thin floorboards. Another scrape, closer this time, followed by the distinct metallic click of a key being inserted into my lock, turning slowly and methodically as if the person on the other side had all the time in the world. I realized then that Elias hadn't just sold me a box. He had sold me a target, and the person who owned these photos was coming back to reclaim their property and silence the person who had seen the evidence. I scrambled backward, my heels catching on the rug as I made my way toward the kitchen to find anything I could use to defend myself. But my eyes never left the door handle as it began to rotate downward. The heavy wood of the door creaked as it met the resistance of the security chain, the only thing currently standing between me and the shadow standing in the dimly lit corridor. "I know you opened it?" A voice whispered through the gap, a low and raspy sound that didn't belong to Elias, but to someone much more desperate and far more dangerous. Through the 3-inch opening, I could see a single eye reflecting the festive lights from my small Christmas tree, a cold and vacant stare that showed no hesitation or remorse for what was about to happen. He began to lean his shoulder against the door, the frame groaning under the pressure, and I knew that the small brass screws holding the chain in place would not last more than a few minutes against a grown man's strength. I felt a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead as I looked around the kitchen, my mind racing through every possible exit, but the fire escape was jammed shut with ice and the drop from the window was high enough to be fatal. Why did I have to buy that box, and what had the man in the photos done to deserve such a meticulous, calculated hunt. Every time the door hit the chain, a new splinter appeared in the wood, and I realized that the intruder wasn't just trying to get in. He was enjoying the process of watching me realize my own helplessness. He stopped pushing for a moment, and the sudden silence was worse than the noise, because I knew he was reaching into his pocket for something to cut through the remaining barrier. I gripped a heavy kitchen knife in my right hand, the cold steel feeling small and insignificant against the looming threat, while I backed away into the shadows of the pantry, hoping he wouldn't see me immediately when the door finally gave way. I could hear him breathing now, a heavy and labored sound that suggested he was exhausted but fueled by a singular, violent purpose. The chain finally snapped with a sharp, metallic pop that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room, and the door swung wide, hitting the interior wall with a thud that echoed through the entire apartment. He stepped inside, a tall figure clad in a dark parka that was still flecked with melting snow, holding a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters in one hand and a roll of gray, duct tape in the other. He didn't rush toward me. Instead, he reached out and calmly flipped the light switch, plunging the room into a terrifying clarity where I could see the scars on his knuckles and the predatory grin on his face. He looked at the open box on the table and then looked at me, his eyes narrowing as he realized I had seen every photograph and understood exactly who he was and what he was capable of doing to a person. "You shouldn't have been so curious," he said, his voice strangely calm as he began to walk toward the kitchen, his boots heavy on the hardwood floor. I gripped the knife tighter, my knuckles turning white, and I wondered if I would have the courage to use it when he reached the shadows where I was hiding. The holiday lights continued to blink red and green against the wall, a festive contrast to the life-or-death struggle that was about to unfold in the center of my living room. I am still here, tucked behind the pantry door, watching him move closer with every heartbeat, and I can only hope that someone outside heard the sound of my door breaking. This story is designed with the same long-form sentence struct. The blizzard was howling against my window panes like a pack of starving animals when the heavy thud echoed from my front porch, a sound so solid and unexpected that it made me jump and spill half of my tea across the coffee table. It was 10 o'clock on Christmas Eve, a time when even the most dedicated delivery drivers should have been home with their families. Yet when I peered through the frost-covered glass, I saw a massive, rectangular crate sitting right in front of my door. There was no delivery truck in the driveway and no footprints leading back to the street, just a pristine blanket of white snow and this mysterious, wooden box wrapped in thick, black industrial plastic. I dragged the heavy thing inside, my muscles straining against its surprising weight, and I noticed that the shipping label was partially torn, showing only my address but a name that definitely wasn't mine. Instead of doing the honest thing and leaving it for the morning, the isolation of the storm and a spark of greedy curiosity took hold of me, and I grabbed a utility knife to slice through the layers of plastic. I expected to find high-end electronics or perhaps a piece of designer furniture meant for the wealthy neighbors up the hill, but as the plastic fell away, I was met with the cold, dull glint of several dozen vacuum-sealed silver bricks. My breath hitched in my chest as I realized this wasn't a mistake a normal courier would make, and the lack of a return address suddenly felt like a deliberate omen of something much darker than a simple logistics error. I reached down to touch one of the bricks, feeling the bite of the cold metal, when a small, high-pitched chirp emitted from somewhere deep inside the crate, followed by a rhythmic, pulsing red light that bled through the packing straw. It was a GPS tracker, and as I stared at its steady blink, I realized that whoever had sent this gift now knew exactly where it was and, more importantly, exactly who had taken it inside. The silence of the house suddenly felt heavy and suffocating, and I found myself looking toward the darkened windows, wondering how many eyes were already watching me from the tree line beyond my backyard. I rushed to my front door to lock it, but as I reached for the handle, the motion sensor light over my garage snapped on, flooding the driveway with a harsh, artificial glare that revealed a black SUV idling at the end of my property. The vehicle had no headlights on, and its windows were tinted so darkly that it looked like a ghost ship sitting in the middle of the storm, waiting for the right moment to dock. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and I tried to convince myself that they were just there to ask for the package back, and that I could simply push it onto the porch and end this nightmare. But then I noticed the passenger door of the SUV opened slowly, and a man stepped out into the snow, not wearing a winter coat or a delivery uniform, but a tactical vest and a thermal mask that obscured everything but two cold, predatory eyes. He wasn't carrying a clipboard or a delivery slip. He was carrying a long, slender tool that looked suspiciously like a glass cutter, and he began to walk toward my house with a slow, terrifyingly confident gait. I scrambled for my phone, but as I looked at the screen, I saw the words "no service" flashing at the top, a consequence of the storm knocking out the local cell tower, or perhaps a more sinister interference from the men outside. I retreated into the kitchen, the only room without large, floor-to-ceiling windows, and I huddled against the cabinets while the sound of the wind outside was joined by a soft, rhythmic tapping on the glass of my living room. It wasn't the tapping of a branch or the pelting of sleet, but the deliberate, calculated sound of someone testing the strength of the panes to find the weakest point of entry. I realized then that if they were willing to drive through a record-breaking blizzard for these silver bricks, they weren't going to leave any witnesses behind to tell the police about the delivery address or the faces of the men who came to collect it. The curiosity that had driven me to open the crate had turned into a death sentence, and I felt the weight of my own greed pressing down on me like the very metal sitting on my dining room floor. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, metallic grinding sound that vibrated through the floorboards and made the hair on the back of my neck stand up in primal fear. They weren't trying the front door anymore. They were at the basement window, the one hidden behind the overgrown shrubs where I had neglected to install a security sensor because I thought it was too small for a human to fit through. I heard the sound of glass shattering, followed by the heavy, muffled thud of a body hitting the concrete floor of the cellar, and I knew I had less than a minute before they found the stairs. I looked at the kitchen island, desperately searching for a weapon, but all I had were dull steak knives and a heavy rolling pin that felt like a joke against the professional violence currently entering my home. I turned off the kitchen lights, plunging myself into a pitch-black world where the only light came from the steady, rhythmic red pulse of the GPS tracker still sitting in the open crate. Every creak of the house seemed to be magnified 1,000 times, and I found myself counting the seconds between my own shallow breaths as I listened for the sound of the basement door opening. I could hear them talking now, their voices low and distorted by radios, discussing the layout of the house with a clinical precision that suggested they had been studying my floor plan long before the package ever arrived. "The target is inside. Retrieve the shipment and clear the site," one of them whispered, the words drifting up through the vents like a poison gas that made my stomach churn with nausea. I realized that I wasn't just a homeowner who had received a wrong delivery. I was a loose end in a high-stakes operation that had gone sideways, and my life was currently being weighed against the value of the silver and found lacking. I crept toward the back door, hoping the snow would muffle my escape, but as I placed my hand on the cold metal latch, I saw a second silhouette standing on the deck, his breath visible in the moonlight as he waited for me to walk right into his arms. I was trapped between a professional killer in my basement and another guarding my only exit, and the realization of my own mortality hit me with a clarity that was almost paralyzing. I looked back at the crate, the red light still pulsing like a heartbeat, and I wondered if there was any way to use the shipment as leverage or if I was already a ghost in their eyes. I could hear the footsteps now, slow and heavy, ascending the wooden stairs from the basement. Each step a countdown to the moment they would turn the corner and find me shivering in the dark. I ducked into the pantry, pulling the door shut until only a tiny sliver of light remained, and I watched through the crack as the first man entered the kitchen, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness like a laser. The beam passed over the empty crate and the scattered silver, and then it began to sweep across the walls, moving closer and closer to the thin wooden door that was the only thing hiding me from his view. I held my breath until my lungs burned, my eyes fixed on the man's gloved hand as he reached out to inspect the disturbed plastic on the floor, his movements efficient and devoid of any wasted energy. He signaled to his partner outside, a quick flash of his light against the window, and I knew that the man on the deck was now moving to flank the house and cut off any other potential escape routes. The intruder in the kitchen turned his head toward the pantry, his flashlight beam stopping exactly at the level of my eyes, and for a heartbeat, I was certain he could see me through the gap in the wood. I felt the cold realization that no help was coming, that the storm had isolated me perfectly for my own execution, and that the gift on my porch had been nothing more than a Trojan horse designed to bring the devil into my living room. He began to walk toward the pantry, his boots clicking on the tile with a finality that signaled the end of my story, and I gripped the small steak knife in my hand, knowing it wouldn't be enough but refusing to go quietly into the winter night. It started subtly, like a quiet whisper of kindness in the harsh December chill, and I, being a lonely person, foolishly welcomed it with an open heart because I wanted to believe that someone out there saw me as more than just a face in the crowd. On the first day of December, I found a small, beautifully wrapped box on my doorstep, containing a single, perfect red rose and a card that simply read, "For the most beautiful heart in this house." And I spent the rest of the evening smiling at the petals while the wind rattled my old windows. My Victorian home, with its creaky floors and drafty hallways, often felt more like a tomb than a sanctuary during the holidays. So the gesture warmed me to my core, prompting me to wonder which of my neighbors could be so thoughtful in a world that usually felt so indifferent. Every morning after that, another gift appeared like clockwork: a delicate silver locket, a rare edition of my favorite book that had been out of print for decades, and a warm cashmere scarf that smelled faintly of pine needles and wood smoke. Each present was perfectly chosen, reflecting an intimate knowledge of my deepest tastes and secret desires, which at first was incredibly flattering. But as the days bled into weeks, a chilling question began to worm its way into my thoughts. How exactly did they know me so well when I never spoke to anyone? The gifts became increasingly personal, escalating from items I loved to things only I would know about, things that should have been locked away in the privacy of my own mind or my own four walls. On December 12th, I found a meticulously drawn sketch of my cat, Mittens, curled up in her favorite sunbeam in the living room, a pose captured from an angle that could only have been seen from inside my own house or perhaps a very specific, hidden vantage point in the yard. On the 15th, a batch of homemade gingerbread cookies appeared in a wicker basket, and when I tasted one, the flavor was an exact replica of the recipe my grandmother used to make before she passed away years ago. I had never shared that recipe with a single living soul, not even my closest friends, and the realization made the cookie turn to ash in my mouth as I looked around my empty kitchen with a sudden, suffocating sense of dread. That's when the warmth of appreciation finally curdled into a cold, hard knot of fear in my stomach, because the only way someone could know these things was if they were watching me, not from across the street, but from right behind my shoulder. One freezing night, as I was drifting off to sleep with the heater humming in the corner, I heard a faint, rhythmic creak coming from the attic directly above my bedroom, a sound like old floorboards flexing under a slow, deliberate weight that didn't belong to a cat. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and I tried to rationalize it away as the settling of the old house or the wind playing tricks on the ancient timbers. But the footsteps were too heavy and too rhythmic to be a coincidence. I lay there for what felt like hours in the pitch black, listening to the phantom movements, my breath catching in my throat every time the creaking paused right above my pillow, as if the person above was leaning down to listen to the sound of my breathing. Who was up there? And how long had they been living in the crawl spaces of my life, watching me sleep and planning their next unnerving gift while I felt perfectly safe? The thought made my skin crawl, turning the comforting warmth of my bed into a cold, vulnerable slab of ice that I was terrified to move from. The next morning, the attic access panel in my hallway, which I always kept bolted shut and painted over, was ajar by just an inch, a sliver of darkness peeking through the crack like a voyeuristic eye. My hands trembled as I grabbed a heavy brass poker from the fireplace and slowly approached the opening, my mind racing through every scenario of what I might find in the dust and cobwebs above. I pushed the panel open with the tip of the poker, expecting a jump scare, but I found nothing but the stale, heavy air of a space that hadn't been touched in years, yet the scent of pine and wood smoke was unmistakable. It was then that I noticed a small, neatly carved wooden bird perched on the edge of the insulation, a miniature cardinal with glossy red paint that seemed to stare at me with lifeless, bead-like eyes, mocking my attempts at security. It was a new gift, left inside the inner sanctum of my home. A clear message that my secret resident was growing bolder and that the locks on my doors were merely suggestions to someone who already owned the house from the inside out. I spent the entire afternoon checking every closet, every crawl space, and every hidden nook and cranny of my sprawling property, my heart leaping into my throat at every shadow cast by the setting sun. I found nothing, no sleeping bag or hidden stash of food, yet the unsettling feeling of being watched never left me. A constant, heavy pressure on the back of my neck that made me want to scream. As dusk settled into a deep, bruising purple, I retreated to my bedroom and locked the door, barricading it with my heaviest mahogany dresser, knowing deep down it was a futile gesture against someone who could move through the walls like a ghost. I huddled under my covers with the lights blazing, the sounds of the house amplifying in the deepening gloom, and I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. But the silence was too perfect, too deliberate. Then, from somewhere within the very wall behind my headboard, a soft, almost imperceptible scratching sound began, like someone gently tracing the drywall with their fingernail, moving in slow circles that felt like a caress. The scratching stopped right behind my head, and then a voice, so soft it was barely more than a vibration in the wood, murmured my name, Sarah. With a familiarity that made my blood turn to lead, I stifled a scream, clamping my hand over my mouth until I could taste the salt on my skin, my body rigid with terror as I realized the sound was coming from the hollow space behind the plaster. My anonymous admirer wasn't just in my house. They were in the very structure of it, using the hidden maintenance tunnels of the old Victorian architecture to move around me while I remained oblivious. "I know you like the gifts, Sarah," the voice continued, the low and raspy tone vibrating through the mattress and into my spine. "I picked them just for you because I've seen how lonely you look when you think no one is watching." Every word sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins, and I realized that he had been there for months, witnessing my private moments and turning them into a twisted game of affection. I managed to reach for my phone on the nightstand, my fingers fumbling with the screen in the dark, and I dialed the emergency number with a shaking hand, pressing the device to my ear as quietly as possible while praying for a dial tone. The voice behind the wall stopped talking instantly, and for a terrifying moment, the house went completely silent, a silence so heavy it felt like it was crushing the air out of the room. Then, a low, guttural chuckle rumbled through the wall, a sound filled with a chilling sense of victory and amusement at my attempt to reach the outside world. "Don't bother, Sarah. I already cut the lines while you were checking the basement, and the snow is far too thick for the signal to reach the tower tonight," he whispered, confirming that he had systematically isolated me for this exact moment. He knew my house better than I did, he knew my habits, and he had been meticulously preparing for this Christmas Eve to be the night he finally stepped out of the shadows. The scratching began again, but this time it was different, violent, and aggressive, like he was trying to claw his way through the lath and plaster with his bare hands. I could hear the distinct sound of wood splintering and the damp, ripping noise of the wallpaper tearing as the wall began to bulge inward toward my bed. "It's almost Christmas, Sarah," he said, his voice no longer a whisper but a low, dangerous growl that echoed in the small room. "And I have one more gift for you, the best one of all, the one you've been waiting for." I scrambled out of bed, my bare feet hitting the cold floorboards as I backed away toward the locked door, watching in horror as a pale, scarred hand punched through the drywall. I realized then that I wasn't the recipient of a romance, but the prize in a hunt, and as the wall crumbled, I knew that the man who had been giving me gifts was finally coming to collect his reward.